Oh, and we're live to review the episode in the title, The God and Country.
Hey, hey. So, Forgotten Country was the 11th episode in production, but the 12th broadcast in the 4th season of Homicide. Originally aired on NBC February 9th, 1996. The episode was written by Jorge Zamacona and Michael S. Chernichin. Those are, once again, that's one Homicide writer and one Law and Order writer. They just flipped the order of them. So, and directed by Ed Sheeran. Aside from a brief cameo by Law and Order character Mike Logan in an earlier episode, Forgotten Country is the first episode to firmly establish a narrative link between Homicide and its sister show Law and Order. This episode follows the events of the Law and Order episode Charm City. In New York City, a mass murderer who has been arrested for setting off a gas bomb attack on a subway begs authorities to see to his family's protection in Baltimore. He fears for their lives until he knows his son is safe. He goes to investigate further. Meanwhile, the bomber's family is indeed attacked in Baltimore, leading to his wife's death and his son's attempt to flee the city, and Bayliss chase him down. NYPD detectives Lennie Briscoe and Reynaldo Curtis travel to Baltimore to aid in the investigation, and it becomes apparent that the two cases are linked to a gas attack at a Baltimore church 5 years earlier that killed 6 people. The investigation leads to the mastermind behind all of the attacks, an anarchist and Special Forces Vietnam War colonel named Alexander Rausch, who reveals that his bomb attacks on black communities were motivated by a desire to start a race war. Though Rausch is in the custody of the Baltimore police, NYC Assistant District Attorney Claire Kincaid demands extradition, creating tension between Briscoe Curtis and starting a court battle between Kincaid and Baltimore District Attorney Ed Danvers. A Baltimore judge approves Kincaid's extradition order as all the detectives make their peace with each other. As the detectives escort Rausch to the train station for his return trip to New York, he suffers a heart attack brought on by deliberately failing to take his medication. Frank Pembleton, who had personalized this case, is heartbroken that Rausch has avoided the consequences of his actions. In a comical subplot, Detective John Munch discovers that after one of his ex-wives divorced him, she had a brief relationship with Briscoe. Munch also learned that he's not as good a pool player as he thinks, losing $500 to Briscoe in short order. So there's the recap. You want to hear what Mr. Morris had to say about it?
Oh yes, Mr. Morris.
All right. Okay. So he says the crossover episode is a popular gimmick on television. Having characters from one series appear on another is often used as an attempt to boost ratings. NBC had already done a variation on this with its Thursday night comedy lineup. Producer David E. Kelley has made something of a career of it for almost every television show he has worked on. Homicide had already done 2 versions of this. Last year, Chris Noth of Law and Order, who played Mike Logan, delivered a suspect from New York back to Baltimore in the aptly titled Law and Disorder. A more daring crossover had been done this season when Mandy Patinkin of Chicago Hope had done an inter-network crossover on A Doll's Eyes as one of the doctors' boys donated organs. But a joint production of the 2 series was something else altogether. Those were filmed in different cities, Law and Order in New York, Homicide in Baltimore. More importantly, the shows, while they were both police procedurals, were completely different in their approaches. Law and Order divides its action into 2 parts, the police investigation and the district attorney's prosecution of the same case. Furthermore, the show is far more dependent on the drama inherent in the wranglings of the legal system and the plot, whereas Homicide gets most of its drama from the characters involved. Law and Order almost never delves into its characters' personal lives, partially because members of the cast depart on a regular basis. In fact, by the time of this crossover, only one character from Law and Order's first season was still on its roster. The intricacies of behind-the-scenes drama of the 2 shows are less relevant than the actual drama on camera. Something of a mix. The Law and Order episode deals with a poison gas attack on a New York subway Manhattan detectives Lennie Briscoe and Ray Curtis have just begun their investigation when Pembleton and Bayliss from Baltimore arrived from Baltimore. 5 years ago, Frank was the primary in the bombing of a similar attack on a Baltimore church. Both attacks were directed primarily at African Americans, which is why Frank is so keyed up. The four detectives barely cooperate with each other. In fact, the New York lieutenant quickly shows them the door. This doesn't stop Frank and Tim from conducting their own simultaneous investigation. As it turns out, Briscoe and Curtis find the bomber mere seconds before Bayliss and Pembleton do. Frank and Tim counter this by withholding the identity of the bomber until they are allowed in the interrogation room. In typical Homicide fashion, they get a confession out of the bomber. However, in typical Law and Order fashion, the confession is excluded because of the way they got it. I disagree with them, by the way. That wasn't typical Law and Order. There's plenty of times that they did more than that. But anyway, if nothing else, Charm City should be lauded because it finally brings front and center the way Frank has danced around the Fifth Amendment for the last 3 years. This is not an issue of Maryland law versus that of the state of New York, as Pembleton argues. It's a constitutional issue. Perhaps the best scene in the Law and Order episode occurs when ADA Jack McCoy gives Pembleton a royal chewing out after his interrogation is excluded from the case. Not only does it give us a chance to see two of America's best actors, Sam Waterston and Andre Braugher, in action, it shows the almighty Pembleton finally getting what is coming to him. It ends with the conviction of the bomber. However, it also raises the obvious question, who did he conspire with in both of the crimes? The question becomes more relevant in Forgotten Country when Frank and Tim, hours after interrogating the wife and son of the bomber, return to find that the wife has been killed. Curtis and Briscoe learn this information from the bomber, who has now been transferred to death row. They show up in Baltimore hours later, wanting in on the investigation. It's about as well as he showed up on their doorstep. Eventually, both detectives capture the man responsible for both bombings and the earlier murder. Alexander Rausch, an ex-Marine Black Ops white supremacist. So it occurs when Pembleton finally gets his chance to interrogate the lying bigot. Frank goes after him with all the righteous indignation that we have seen in interrogating Annabella Wilgus and Gordon Pratt the previous season. As in this case, like those others, it is clear that there is more at stake for Frank than there is for the usual murderer. He wants to bring this monster to justice in all its glory. Unfortunately, he never gets the chance. ADA Claire Kincaid arrives from New York to extradite Rausch to stand trial for the earlier bombings. She does so, but mere minutes after they exchange him to Briscoe and Curtis, Rausch dies from a possibly self-induced heart attack. We then see one of the most stunning scenes of the fourth season when Frank unsuccessfully tries to resuscitate Rausch and then breaks down over the fact that his nemesis has managed to escape justice. We haven't seen Frank get this upset over the fate of a murderer since Every Mother's Son in Season 3. In many ways, the crossover between the two shows works well. However, it must be admitted that the show doesn't so much tell one overriding story as present a game that moves from one team's home court to another. The overall case is very interesting, but in changing the focus to Bayliss, Pembleton, and Munch in both stories, the other characters get denied significant screen time themselves. Even Jelko Ivanek, Homicide's bearer of the legal system, doesn't get a significant amount of screen time. Two other crossovers between the shows that both series did. We also get some very amusing moments between Briscoe and Munch when John finds out that the New York City detective had an affair with his first ex-wife. There is all a flirtation of sorts between Bayliss and Claire Kincaid, which, as any viewer of Law and Order would know, is a futile effort. The crossover was such a big success that there would be two similar ones in later seasons. The crossover would take place when L&O producers Dick Wolf would cast Richard Belzer as John Munch to play the role in the first Law and Order spinoff. So in many ways, this joint effort was a great success, but Charm City and Forgotten Country are so dependent on each other that airing them in normal syndication was nearly impossible. More than that, one gets the feeling that there are too many stories going on simultaneously, and it gets more than a little crowded. As a crossover, the show works well. As a good examples of both shows, it is not quite up to their high standard. And he gives Charm City a score of 7 and Forgotten Country a score of 7.5. So, of this one, Ben.
You made an interesting point there. I'll just write it down about what happens in syndication. Because obviously, when it's on first broadcast, it's easier to watch the other show. Whereas when it's in syndication, it's harder to find that particular episode because they might not be running the series at the same time.
Yep. And they're not even in the same season of, it's seasons of the shows, so it's like, even if you had a channel that ran them back to back, they wouldn't be at the same point if they started at the same time. They'd have to line it up the way I did, where I watched a ton of Law and Order episodes to get to the point where this was.
See, I remember that when they would have like crossovers of like Matlock and Murder, She Wrote.
Yeah, I think the thing is, a lot of the crossovers that were done with sitcoms where it didn't really matter as much. It wasn't really a continuing story. It was just sort of, hey, this character from that other show showed up on this one for some reason. So it really didn't matter that much if you ran them out of order, because it wasn't usually about finishing a story on the other one. It was just, they were on, the characters were on each other's shows.
Or they could just show the episode twice.
Yeah, it was entirely a gimmick.
Have the same episode appear on, because they rerun the episodes anyway. Because
yes,
the television series, the TV season is longer than, say, 26 episodes. So even Star Trek, they would repeat. There wasn't a new episode of Star Trek every week.
Well, yeah.
So, given the principle that you get repeating episodes, then what they could have done is like just had a episode where they were both in, and then like had that shown that on both channels. Well, it depends. That would be thinking ahead towards syndication. Anyhow, what did I think of this? I thought that maybe this story could have been stretched out a bit more to another episode. That maybe there was a bit more of that there could have been more going on in the background.
Yeah, I think, and he sort of made that point too, and I think probably the reason they didn't do that is because the whole point was, we're trying this crossover thing, and the network probably said, yeah, we can do this, but we need to have the story finish in the Homicide episode, so there's not something where people are like strung along or whatever, Although, they didn't want to make it too complicated for the viewers. Make it seem like they're stupider or something. But the thing is, with Law and Order being more of an episodic show, you can miss episodes of it and still understand what's going on because it's much more isolated to what's going on in that individual episode. Much like he pointed out, there's not as much delving into the characters' personal lives. I mean, they make comments about themselves while they're in the midst of cases, but you don't see the element, the elements to do with like Frank's wife pregnancy and and Bayliss and those kind of things. I'm tired and I'm not thinking of stuff. Example is there's more stuff that continues on episodes, whereas Law and Order, it's sort of like it's more of like you're just getting a window into that case that they follow over weeks or months or whatever it is. So it's a little different in terms of presentation. You miss a Law and Order episode and you don't know what happened in that episode, but watching the next one, it doesn't matter a whole lot unless it was an episode where you actually had like a cast change or something. And then, but other than certain events like that, you didn't miss much. Whereas Homicide, you might be, for instance, in the next episode, which I won't spoil a lot of, but in the one after this, there's some significant events that affect future stuff in the next episode. So if you were to miss that one, which is why, again, NBC running them out of order made things weird, because the next one actually aired before this crossover episode, which as it is, didn't really affect it that much. Was sort of a certain amount of, confusion maybe in terms of, anyway, I won't go into that and just say that that the network screwed with things. But anyway.
So the network didn't broadcast it at the right time, so that wouldn't that have messed up the cross promotion?
No, I mean, in this case, there was a reason they had to line them up and so that they were the same week. Understood why they had to put this one in this week, but they still could have. They aired the previous ones. They moved Full Moon to near the end of the season, right? And that didn't make any sense. So, basically, they wanted this one to be, in the first week of Sweeps, which is where they aired it. It was in February. And the next one actually aired before it in January.
There was a reference there that Mr. Morris made to Jill Hennessy. Is her character a lesbian?
No.
Because it's just that he said...
At least if she is. Cover.
It's just that he said a
yeah,
fruitless...
well, he said it was futile. That's because it's heavily implied that she's involved with her boss. And so basically they're saying that, she was involved with him so she wouldn't go for Bayliss, which, again, because they don't cover a lot of the... You really don't know enough about Kincaid that she would necessarily see whatever her relationship was with McCoy as an exclusive thing. They never said that specifically.
Is McCoy Waterstone? Or Waterson?
Yeah. Right. So he may just be referring to the fact that she shoots down a lot of come-ons from dudes. I mean, that may be all he was saying, is to getting hit on by people and turning him down. So.
Right. What do I think about this episode? I think that I think Munch had better lines in the earlier seasons. I think Munch was funnier in season 1.
All right.
The scenes could have been better with Briscoe and Munch. So I thought, they're okay. I mean, they could have even with the design of what they had, they could have had better dialogue. I mean, for instance, Jeff, given the same thing, I think you could have written better dialogue.
Well, thanks.
Between Munch and Briscoe.
I think I probably could have too, but I have a pretty high opinion of myself as a dialogue writer, so that's not necessarily a diss to the Homicide writers or the Law and Order. We can say that the Law and Order guy wrote the dialogue in that scene. It was probably. I mean, I imagine the way they did it is they probably came together when they were finished with their respective parts, and sort of edited each other's stuff to make it fit for both episodes, I imagine. The producers having a say in it too, but don't have all the behind the scenes on that. There's not any. The DVD doesn't have commentary on those episodes or anything, so you don't get much insight into that.
I think when he said, yeah, sorry.
The next episode that we are going to watch in Homicide actually does have a commentary on it by Clark Johnson, who plays Lewis.
When he made that reference to Solomon, I would have thought that Pembleton would have corrected him by saying that was just a gambit. Solomon did that in order so that the real mother of the child would give up the claim of the child, because so they don't split the baby in half.
Yeah, but I think Pembleton didn't do that because he didn't care enough to.
That's fair enough. And also,
it wasn't an important correction to make.
Yeah, and also it's a complex explanation to make.
Yeah, it was sort of
some dude's random joke.
Yeah, right.
Trying to say.
Yeah, it's just sort of a sarcastic comment that Pembleton wasn't going to justify with a response.
Yeah.
If he'd been in a little bit better mood, he might have smiled or chuckled at it, but as it was, he was concentrating on other things.
Right, so in this story, my opinion is that it's hard to know whether Pembleton's an ESFP or an ISFP.
Okay.
Have you considered whether he's an ISFP, or have you always thought ESFP?
Yeah, but what makes you say that?
Well, he just seems to be a person who's very driven by his personal ethics, and it almost seems to be more important to him than his actual, artisan thing of improvising. He seems to be a very ethical person.
Well, what do you think that ESFPs are driven by?
Well, I would say it's more the performance, and it's things where they set up the things where he doesn't, at least socially, is not extroverted. But it's mainly as
Well, you and I have discussed the fallacy of that, though, that assuming that social behavior indicates introversion or extroversion. Because, yeah, if you look at that and you compare him and Lewis, you might say Lewis seems more extroverted than. If you pay attention to what they say and their actions over the course of the whole series, to me it becomes pretty obvious that that's the other way around. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I didn't write the characters, so obviously I can't say they're definitely this type because I made them that way or something, because I didn't make them. But that's my interpretation. Because the thing is Pembleton, he's much more kind of like short-term focused, though. It's like, yeah, he has these things where he gets these ideas in his head and he's like, oh, I'm going to make an example out of you and we're going to do these, I'm going to make everybody know your name, whatever. But then a week later or two, he might, he's on to something else sometimes. It's not really, he doesn't stay focused on that. It's more of a in the moment thing that's driving him now. Whereas Lewis, as you'll see as the show goes on, sometimes has much more long-lasting sort of crusades he goes on. Whereas Pembleton does not really do that as much. He has his kind of constant things that sort of pick at him and his moral dilemmas and stuff. But he reacts much more based on sort of what's in front of him. And so even as strong as a reaction he had to Roush dying, going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the future, because it's like, okay, that's over with. And so that's what I guess I would see as a little bit of the difference, is that, yes, driven by his personal ethics, but I don't think that necessarily indicates ISFP over ESFP. I think it's just he's somebody who has strong views that he's going to. Other times when he's expressing opinions that kind of come off as strong, you can really tell he's sort of just messing with the person he's talking to.
Yeah.
He's sort of getting reactions, especially when he's talking to Bayliss. He likes to kind of throw stuff at Bayliss and see how Bayliss will react. Vice versa. Lewis is fuzzier. Like, you can tell just by Lewis, even when he's acting like he's trying to be tough and stuff, all it would take was just a little bit of of a prick and you'd get to the fluffy inside of Lewis. Pembleton is it's a lot harder to crack that. So I think he's sort of been toughened up by certain things that have happened in his past, where he sort of does that retreat into a shell thing sometimes, where he doesn't want anybody to understand some of the pains and things that he has. He expresses it as sort of like rants more than a constant thing. Whereas Lewis, he just walking around in the squad room, he just kind of has that look on his face like he just wants to be everybody's friend, hang out with people and wants to have a friendly relationship with people. So it's different than kind of carrying like a moral weight or something on you.
I think we can say for sure that he's an SFP.
Yeah, I think so. And I thought that before I even knew what that meant, really, because watching the show the first time through, I wasn't familiar with typology stuff. I just knew that there had never been a character on television that I related to more than Frank Pembleton.
Yeah.
And there were a few that have come close, but he was a guy that it kept on being instances throughout the show where he would say something. I'm just like, I've never heard anybody express that before. It's kind of like when I told you in chapter of Please Understand Me Too, and I was like, wow, this book knows me better than my own mother does. And so it was the same kind of feeling where I was like, and if I had the opportunity to write for a television show, I would create a character that was even more like me, because there's certain things that versions, in Pembleton's focus from what my focus is. So the specifics of things that he may focus on don't necessarily line up with mine. Obviously, we have different backgrounds, different, came from different places, and I'm white, he's black, things like that. There's differences that affect a life, but anytime he was saying things that were sort of like neutral to a circumstance, that were just sort of like his perspective on stuff, I related tremendously to it. So, I mean, he's not that far away, and I've often said that, when it comes to comparing types, where the difference is, i.e., there's really not a whole lot of difference between the two. It's just sort of certain aspects. It's a matter of degree.
I think that the character of Curtis came over a little better for me in this episode than in the Law and Order episode. That might have just been the mood I was in. I don't know.
Curtis might be an SFP too. Again, like I said, this was his first.
Is that scrub face?
Yeah, this first season of Law and Order that he was on. So they haven't really, and like they already don't delve a lot into the personal lives of the characters as it is. So you only have to go on basically sort of their work personality most of the time. Curtis, that he does tend to try to do that, like reach out and try to make a personal connection with the people that he's talking to. So that's what kind of inclines me to believe that he could be an SFP also. Whereas Briscoe is a lot more less like personal connection oriented. Like he'll spit out the facts and he'll talk about his history sometimes, but he doesn't tend to seem like he's trying to like get a rapport with suspects or witnesses or anything like that. He's just trying to get the facts.
Well, to me, it seems like a one-liner machine.
Well, sometimes, yeah. But like I said, Munch is sometimes like that too. So,
but I think they get the balance right though with Munch, where they're not doing it.
Yeah,
all the while. I think maybe with the way I've seen Briscoe in these two episodes, it's like it's too much.
And I think Homicide benefits from having a slightly larger cast where you can kind of rotate some of those things. And as we've seen, Munch has episodes where he's pretty much in there just as comic relief and doesn't have a whole lot to do with the story. But yeah, I would agree in terms of some of his dialogue was better at the beginning. I think, as I've said before, there's sort of different eras of Homicide within the show.
Yeah.
And we're in this fourth season, we're coming sort of to the end of a particular era of the show, where Henry Brommel was one of the show. He did the third and fourth season. He was, so-called showrunner along with. In the fifth season, when David Simon joins the staff, the guy who wrote the Homicide book, I think you see a little bit of another shift. And once again, it's balanced because you had the network interfering as still, but you have sort of a tug of war going on there. But Simon's influence, I think, was a big positive on the show. The network interfering was a big negative. So you end up with somewhere in between in terms of what the end result is. But I think you do see a little bit of the dialogue in season 5, if nothing else, because Simon tries to work in real stuff he heard when he was with the Baltimore PD. He tries to kind of get it back, kind of like how we talked about when John Nathan Turner took over Doctor Who, and he tried to kind of bring the science back into the science fiction. Yeah, Simon kind of does that he tries to bring more of the realistic cop stuff back into the show, where it had maybe veered a little bit away from that. So,
yeah, because he used the script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, and then went, and as an example of how much he was interested in the science, when he stopped being script editor on Doctor Who, he went back to doing scientific articles. So he was always pretty interested in the science of Christopher H. Bidmead.
So anyway, I think when I think about the earlier the episode, I think what was best at the beginning of Homicide was they were able to balance like different plots within the same episode and do a good job of sort of balancing that. Part of that, again, was not their fault, but the network interfering and telling them to do less of that because they wanted it to be simpler for the audience to follow what was going on and not have quite as many different things being discussed at the same time.
It's more of a personal preference thing where you think that a character is a one-liner machine, rather than I think it's because there's a lot of the actual actor's personality in the character of Munch, whereas his one-liners seem to come more character-based, and also he's not doing it all the while. It's that's one of the, I think you may agree with this, that when an American sitcom is written not brilliantly, then the characters are all one-liner machines, whereas the better sitcoms, it's more characterization based.
To have kids on them, there's a huge difference between, unfortunately, the majority where the kids really are just sort of like walk in, say your one-liner, get your laugh, and walk off.
Yeah.
Versus the shows that had more realistic kids, like Home Improvement, for instance, was one that I think of, where those kids seem like real kids. But yeah, I think as far as Briscoe, I think part of that is the format of Law and Order, is that the way it's presented, there really isn't a whole lot of opportunity to delve into a lot of stuff. Sort of that the character's a little bit more, and Briscoe sort of as the wisecracking, guy that, that's kind of how he talks. He makes his comments and then they get the facts, and there's not a whole lot more to him that's established. I think with Law and Order, usually when they introduce a new character, the first episode they're in usually has more about their character than anything after that. It's sort of like, they're like, hey, let me tell you a little about this guy. Okay, now that you know that, they're going to act like everybody else, and so that's, the weakness of the format, perhaps trying to stuff all that into one episode, is that you have situations like where somebody sort of comes off as being the one-liner machine, like you said.
Whereas I think the actor's good, the guy that plays Briscoe.
I agree. And the previous partner he had, Logan, mentioned in that review, played by Chris Noth, his thing was it kind of tended to be stereotyped as the cop that was always like ready to get up in somebody's face or have a fight with somebody. It's
funny because when the scrub face were gone, that's what he was doing.
So that was the funny thing, is that they it was mainly a cost-cutting move because Logan was up, Noth was up for a contract renewal, and Dick Wolf decided to save money by replacing him. And so at the time, Benjamin Bratt was a discount. Of course, he ended up, probably making more money in movies than Noth did. I don't know. He was in the Sex and the City movies, but other than that, I don't know what. He's hadn't exactly had a big movie career or anything. But anyway, so there is a little bit of that where you figure, well, some of his early stuff was probably written for the other guy. Things that we've already talked about has happened on multiple shows. But yeah, because of Law & Order's format, it's easier to do that, where you give the dialogue to another character because the characters are not quite as developed. So,
right.
Whereas on Homicide, it would sound weird if you had, a new character, like if you brought in, you bring in Kellerman, for instance, and then you gave him lines that were supposed to have gone to Felton. Well, they have some similarities, but there's enough of a difference where you might think this sounds a little weird coming from him. So.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, I think the dialogue in Homicide seems more character-based.
Yeah.
And that is the trick, to write it.
Yeah, and it helps, obviously in crossover things, it's a delicate balance because you're trying to have characters from two different shows and make them true to their character across the board. And I liked the scene, the bar scene, towards the end when they had all the characters together. That was, I think Kellerman was about the only one missing of the detectives from that scene. That one was pretty good. I like, again, Homicide's details with having little bits of information come out in the dialogue that aren't necessarily like vital to the plot, but they're things that people would really say.
I think that when those two writers, when they were writing that scene, I think they should have like brought in Richard Belzer, like to help with the dialogue in that section.
Oh, like the scene with the pool table scene.
Yeah, and things like that, just to like spice it up a little bit with, because you got this guy who's a comedian, so why not try to bring him into the process a bit?
Well, I was talking about the scene with all of the characters together.
Oh yeah, But just generally though, like, you know, take advantage.
Yeah, well, I agree. Yeah, and I don't know how much time they had to do that. It's possible that it was kind of a lot of pressure for them to get it done, and
yeah,
they may have not been able to spend a lot of time on that. I know one thing I do remember is that Jerry Orbach, who plays Briscoe, said that he was jealous of the Homicide people when his first appearance, because of kind of what we said earlier about how on Law and Order they never really spent a lot of time in his personal lives, where he was like, you know, it was fun to be able to do this, to have this scene with Belzer where we're like, oh yeah, I slept with your ex-wife. You know, he's like, I never got to do anything that was fun like that on Law and Order. So he enjoyed it quite a bit.
Right. I was thinking it might be interesting if they like have brought him in to Homicide, pinched him from Law and Order, brought in Orbach's character.
Yeah, they didn't do that though. He would be back in both of the subsequent crossover episodes.
Oh yes. What we can do is we can go through the credits. I don't really know what else to think about this episode, except again in the interrogation room, who doesn't be quiet. They're always talking. Right, so now I've got it into my head that this guy is the lawyer.
Yeah, Danvers.
Yeah. And then we got... who's Sagan Lewis?
I don't know.
Right. So is he a big name? Maybe he was the J.K. Simmons?
J.K. Simmons, that name I've heard before. But I don't remember off the top of my head who that is.
How about this Kevin Greer? Or Kevin Gear?
Yep, don't know.
Alright. We've got these, of course.
Yeah, those, obviously they tell us who they are, so.
Yeah. Okay, and then we've got that.
Same director for both episodes.
Yeah.
And they might have done that on purpose because he was one of the few directors that had done both Homicide and Law and Order, so it made sense for him to be the guy that directed these. That judge has appeared on Homicide before and will appear again in the future, so she's a recurring character.
Tell you, I would have been pissed off. You know when she said that line about, take count to 10.
Yeah.
Very patronising
Well,
line.
Well, I mean, she and Danvers have obviously he's appeared before her plenty of times, so
yeah,
that too bad. She's a little bit of a smack talking judge, so.
All right.
In fact, she may be Sagan Lewis. I'm not sure. She was probably listed in the beginning cast. Yeah. So the Kendall was the son of the Egan guy.
Yeah.
Roxana, I think, was the girl working in the bar. Dyer's the medical examiner.
Yeah.
Stephanie was the wife, maybe?
Maybe they
And
should.
of course, Shiner,
Maybe
other medical examiner.
they could add a bit more detail here. But you know, there's not really much time because it's only flash it up for a few seconds. So
I like the line where Shiner said, "How come you call her Dr. Dyer and you just call me Shiner? I'm a doctor too."
yeah, I thought that was good. Because I remember thinking of that when they came in, they just called him Shiner. Just sort of like said what I was thinking. Right. What else about this episode? Well, at least the fact that he died at the end was a little bit unexpected.
Yeah.
And it was very good acting from Andre Braugher's, getting very emotional. That was like faultless acting from him.
Yeah. It was typical Homicide fashion in terms of not giving you necessarily the satisfying conclusion that the audience would necessarily want. You know, instead you have this kind of left at the end feeling like, you know, this isn't what anybody really wanted to happen.
So because of that, I think I'll bump up my score to an 8.
Oh, nice. That the sort of camaraderie between the characters and the bar scene and stuff like that bumped it up to a 7 for me, because I probably, without that, probably would have given it a 6. But just because I think the story itself isn't particularly great, but I think it's saved by good performances by the cast and you know, and them working well together. And I think there's some, you know, I can't find any fault with the direction or anything like that. It just, the story itself was a little bit unsatisfying to me. But like I said, sort of the specialness of it usually sort of gives a little extra to me. And I liked the scenes with the, you know, characters intermingling and stuff like that. I thought were good. I think, you know, low parts were included, the stuff with the son. I mean, all that really wasn't that interesting to me. I understood why it was in there. I mean, it made sense. It was realistic, but that kid didn't do much for me, and so the scenes involving all that really didn't add anything to it, in my opinion. So yeah, I'll give it a 7, just like I did the. But the next episode is one of my favorites of the season. It's a big step up, and features a guest starring performance. So.
Nominated, but not winning.
Nope, she didn't win, but she gives a good performance. So
yeah, I mean, you could just be nominated. Actually,
yeah.
when it comes to acting, because,
right, because Homicide didn't get a lot of acting awards, so it was, you know, kind of under appreciated in that area. So whenever it actually did get something, it was, or even a nomination, it was nice. So yeah. Anyway. You didn't have anything particularly else to say about this one, right?
No, unfortunately not.
Okay. All right. Well, join us next time for The Hat.
Bye, folks.
Bye.